Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Before there were legions, before emperors ruled from marble palaces, there were two brothers raised by a wolf who sparked the legend of Rome. According to Roman myth, in the year 753 BCE, twin brothers Romulus and Remus were abandoned on the banks of the Tiber River. Left to die, they were miraculously saved, not by humans, but by a she-wolf. Raised in the wild, the brothers grew strong. But when the time came to build a city, their bond shattered. Romulus killed his brother in a dispute over the city's location and named the settlement after himself, Rome. Rome began as a humble collection of huts on 7 hills. Its people were a mix of Latins, Sabines, and Etruscans, farmers, shepherds, and warriors. Under a line of kings, Rome slowly grew in power and organization. One king built the first sewer system, another founded religious rites, and one, Tarquinius Superbus, became the symbol of tyranny. Tarquinius, the last king, ruled with fear and cruelty. When his son committed a terrible crime, the people had enough. Led by the nobleman Lucius Junius Brutus, the Romans revolted and vowed never again would they bow to a king. And so, in 509 BCE, the Roman Republic was born. A new age of citizen rule had begun. Though the tale of Romulus may be myth, the idea behind it endured. Rome's story begins not with peace, but with passion, power, and blood. Though it may be centuries before Rome becomes the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, the legends of its foundation tell us everything we need to know about the Romans themselves. What's coming next? You won't want to miss it. Next time, check out episode 2, From Kings to Republic. So what do you think? Does this origin story live up to the empire it inspired? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more epic tales of the past. Like many great cities, Rome had a legendary beginning. Or at least, it would like you to believe that. The story goes back to the year 753 BCE. Two twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, are left on the banks of the Tiber River to die. The usual story has it that their father, King Amulius of Alba Longa, was pressured by an oracle's prophecy. It said that if he didn't sacrifice his nephew Romulus and his son Remus, then they would overthrow him. So Amulius ordered his own brother, King Numitor, to kill the twins. But at the last second, King Numitor couldn't go through with it. He gave the twins to a shepherd and his wife to raise in secret. But word got around anyway. Eventually, the twins' older sister, Princess Rhea Silvia, was forced to flee to the area where she believed her father, King Numitor, had been taken. She sought refuge at the altar of the long-forgotten goddess of war, Mars. And according to some sources, the god of war himself took pity on her and impregnated her. The twins were named Romulus and Remus, after the god of war and the messenger god, both of Mars's allies. When the boys were grown, they tracked down their grandfather, King Numitor, who was still held captive in the neighboring city of Alba Longa. With the help of the god Mercury, the twins freed their grandfather and reclaimed the throne for him. In gratitude, King Numitor offered them whatever they wanted, but Remus wanted to create a city of his own. One that was built upon the foundations of Mars's sanctuary. Romulus agreed, but he wanted the city to be built further to the north, near the Tiber River, which flows into the Mediterranean just south of modern-day Florence. Remus thought that site was too far from the coast and the trade it brought, so he decided to build his city here, on the Palatine Hill. A nearby she-wolf must have thought the hill was a great place for a den, since she soon adopted the twin boys as her own. Legend says that the she-wolf nursed the infants and cared for them as her own, and that a woodpecker kept predators away from the site. Eventually, the twins were discovered and taken in by a couple of shepherds. They lived as human children until they were old enough to start a city. But the brothers couldn't agree on where to put it. Their conflicting views eventually led to a fight, and Romulus ended up killing his brother. Grief-stricken, he named the city Rome in honor of his brother. That is, of course, unless you ask the Etruscans. Some of them insist the city got its name from an archaic word, meaning strength. Archaeologists haven't uncovered any evidence that supports the Romulus and Remus story, but there may have been a kernel of truth to it. After all, archaeologists have found a few skulls that seem to show cranial deformation, which was often associated with elite children in the region at the time. We also know that Rome wasn't built in a day. The earliest settlements in the area date back to around 10th century BCE, the oldest tale of 7 villages inhabited by the Latins, a group of Indo-European people who spoke an early form of Latin. Somewhere around 950 BCE, the Latins merged with other local tribes, the Sabines and the Etruscans. As these cultures mixed, so did their beliefs, including their ideas of the origins of Rome. It's likely that early Romans passed these stories down through generations until they were written down centuries later, by the time the Romans wrote down their founding myths. However, they were very much in the business of propaganda. By making their city's origins glorious, they could make their own rulers seem all the more divine. And though Romulus and Remus may have been a figment of someone's imagination, the Romans' story actually started on the Palatine Hill. Around 750 BCE, a community of huts slowly developed on top of a former Etruscan settlement. Today we call it the Palatine, which gives us our word for the type of government the Romans created after they overthrew the last king in 509 BCE, a republic. This isn't to say that there was nothing glorious about Rome's founding. There were several groups living in what we today call Italy. The Etruscans to the north, the Greeks to the south, and many smaller tribes scattered throughout. None of them had risen to dominate the entire peninsula yet, but Rome would be the first. In 616 BCE, a delegation of Romans went to the Greek colony of Cumae to consult an oracle about their origins. But the oracle had no answer for them, only a warning. If Rome was going to grow in power, it would have to do so on someone else's bones. Rome wasn't destined to become great because of its natural resources or geography. No, it was destined for greatness through conquest. And that's exactly what happened. Over the next 2 centuries, Rome expanded its territory, absorbing neighboring Italian tribes and subjugating others. This expansionism would become one of the hallmarks of Roman culture. However, to truly become a powerhouse, Rome needed a good government. Over the next 2 centuries, Rome would grow from a small city to a major power in central Italy. During that time, the Romans would establish a monarchy, then revolt and establish a republic. And as Rome grew in size and wealth, its government became more and more complex. At first, Rome was ruled by 7 kings of varying degrees of infamy. The most infamous was probably Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, who ruled like a god over his people. Many Romans viewed him with hatred, which made his removal all the more popular. But there was a cost to ending the monarchy. Sure, the Romans would now choose their leaders through a series of votes, but that meant that not everyone could participate. Not all Romans were equal under the new republican government. As Rome grew in power, the patricians, or wealthy landowners, started to write down the stories of Rome's early history. Those stories often cast the Romans as heroes who fought against tyrannical kings or invading armies. These tales helped to shape Roman identity, but they also served as a warning about what could happen if the Romans ever let another monarch take power. To learn more about Rome's transition from kings to republic, check out episode 2, From Kings to Republic. Thanks for watching. The great thing about learning history is that once you understand the basic principles, you can use them to interpret current events. The best part is, you don't even have to be in ancient Rome or Renaissance Florence to do it. You can do it right now with Nebula and Curiosity Stream. Right now, I'm watching Inside the Mind of a Con Artist. It's a fascinating look into the world of one of the greatest con artists of our time. If you love learning history, then you will love Curiosity Stream. They have thousands of fantastic nonfiction titles from some of the best filmmakers in the game. If you sign up right now, you'll get access to all of this content for less than $1 a month. Not only that, but you'll also be helping us produce more videos. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Welcome to this animated history series, where we bring the past to life with all its beauty and brutality. From Kings to Republic, Rome Rebels, Part 2 of 5. Last time, we witnessed a city born of blood and myth. But what happens when the people demand freedom from tyranny? Rome is growing, expanding its territory and influence. But back in the city, there's a growing divide between the wealthy elite and everyone else. And when one of Rome's nobles makes a move to restore the monarchy, simmering tensions boil over, and the city erupts in violence. But can the Roman people come together to save their fledgling republic? Let's dive into it. The year is 509 BCE, and the seventh and final king of Rome is Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquinius the Proud. Now, you may remember him from last episode as the guy who made Romulus his partner in crime after murdering his own father, Numitor. Tarquin the Proud took the throne by force, and he wasted no time in making his authority felt throughout the Roman countryside. While he wasn't an innovator by any means, Tarquin did expand Rome's borders through brute force and claimed loyalty from neighboring Italian tribes. This period of expansion brought wealth and prestige to Rome, but it also brought a huge number of slaves. And those slaves provided the labor needed to make Rome more urban and thus more complicated. No longer was Rome just a small collection of settlements surrounded by farms and pastures. Now there were streets and shops and merchants and artisans and, yes, poor people. All those people came to Rome looking for work or fleeing conflict or being dragged there as prisoners. They didn't have much political power, but there were enough of them that Tarquin knew he had to keep them pacified to stay in power. So he threw them a few bones, granting them citizenship and letting them participate in religious festivals, allowing the common folk to feel like part of something greater. But this didn't fool everyone, especially not Lucius Junius Brutus. He was a member of the patrician class, the landowning aristocracy, and he despised Tarquin. To Brutus, his fellow patricians, the growing population of Rome was a threat, a dangerous mob that would only get bigger if Tarquin allowed citizenship to anyone breathing. Worse yet, in Brutus's mind, the king was flaunting his wealth, displaying captured artworks and spoils of war, while the real Romans lived in poverty. As far as Brutus was concerned, Tarquin was nothing more than a spoiled Etruscan barbarian pretending to be a Roman. But the breaking point comes when Tarquin's son, Sextus, brutally assaults Lucretia, the wife of a respected Roman senator. According to Livy, Sextus attacked Lucretia at home while she was alone. She resisted him at first, but he overpowered her and defiled her. Horrified at what had happened, Lucretia killed herself. The news of her tragic fate spread quickly, igniting outrage throughout the city. Romans gathered before the altar of the goddess of liberty, vowing revenge. Among them was Lucius Junius Brutus, who swore an oath to end the tyranny of the kings once and for all. With the support of the influential patrician families, Brutus called for the deposition of Tarquinius Superbus. The Roman nobles met and agreed. Rome would no longer be ruled by a king. Tarquinius and his family were banished from the city, and Rome became a republic, replacing one tyrant with many. Instead of a single king, Rome would now be run by 2 consuls, elected officials who would serve one-year terms and hold the highest executive powers. The Roman people could vote for their leaders, but it was really more like voting for your favorite flavor of slightly less terrible. Only adult male citizens could vote, and property ownership was required to be a candidate. Slaves, foreigners, and women couldn't vote. And to be honest, even if you could, nobody expected things to change fast. The Roman Republic was a mess, a convoluted mix of competing interests and power struggles. But it was a mess that worked, at least for a while. Power was now in the hands of the people, or at least to some of them. Instead of a king, Rome was led by 2 consuls, elected annually to prevent tyranny. A powerful senate of aristocrats advised them, and citizens gathered in assemblies to vote on laws. But the republic was far from equal. The elite patricians held most of the power, while commoners, plebei, were left voiceless. There was no denying that Rome had changed, but change isn't always good. At least, not right away. Over the next century, the plebei grew frustrated with the lack of representation, so they started threatening to leave the city, which would devastate Rome's economy. Faced with this rebellion, the patricians negotiated. In 494 BCE, the plebeians walked out of the city in protest, refusing to fight in the war against the Aequi. The strike lasted 3 years, and Rome lost 2 major battles because of it. Finally, the Romans gave in and created the office of the tribune of the plebei, a protector of the common people. That's right, you heard it here first. The commoners of Rome got fed up and went on strike. Sounds familiar? Well, that's because the concept of the workers' protest isn't unique to the modern era. It's a tactic as old as Rome itself. The Sabine women weren't the first group to go on strike, and they definitely wouldn't be the last. We don't know for sure exactly how strikes worked in ancient Rome, but we do know that they were effective. The following decades saw increased tension between the patricians and plebeians. There were revolts, protests, and compromises, and slowly the balance of power began to shift. The plebeians gained representation in the government, and eventually the right to hold important offices, including consul. But the path to equality was a long one, and as Rome expanded, new problems arose. Victories abroad brought captives into Italy, people Rome had conquered and subjugated. How would Rome deal with these captives? Enslave them, free them, force them to integrate into Roman culture? The question of slavery was a contentious issue in ancient Rome, and there were varying opinions about how to treat captives. Sometimes they were forced into servitude. Sometimes they were set free with restrictions, and sometimes they were granted full citizenship. For example, the Samnites and other Italian peoples were often enslaved. whereas captives from Greek cities like Syracuse tended to be granted citizenship. There was no universal policy, and decisions were made on a case-by-case basis. As for the rest of Italy, well, Rome wasn't done conquering it. Next, it was the turn of the central Italian tribes, the Etruscans and the Greeks along the coast. Rome would face resistance, but none of it was enough to stop the Republic's advance. By the end of the 4th century, the Samnites, Lucanians, and Bruttians were subdued. The Greeks were Romanized, and the Etruscans were gone. Central Italy was now a Roman province. Not bad for a couple centuries. But wait, what about that civil war brewing among the nobility? Yeah, that's probably gonna be an issue. Well, it's been 2,000 years since the fall of Rome, but its legacy lives on in art, architecture, literature, and law. And though Rome might be gone, its story certainly isn't. The rise and fall of an empire, the fall and rise of dictators, political intrigue, conspiracy, and betrayal. It's all here in the series, and thanks to our supporters for making this series possible. Your support allows us to bring the ancient world to life for millions of viewers around the globe. We've got loads of bonus material on our site, including blooper reels, a digital art gallery, and exclusive podcasts. And we're always cooking up new perks for our supporters. If you'd like to join our community, head over to our website or click the join button below. You'll get access to everything on our site, plus behind-the-scenes peeks and your name in the credits. Join today and become part of the team. I am the historian. This is the rise and fall of Rome. Last time we left off, Tarquin the Proud had been chucked out of the city in a revolution. The Romans had established a republic with elected officials instead of a king. But everything wasn't peachy keen in the city of Rome. Two rival factions were vying for power. The patricians or aristocrats wanted to keep the government in their hands. And the other side, mostly landowning commoners called plebeians, wanted more say in how Rome was run. It took a couple of centuries, but eventually the plebs got what they wanted. And during this time, Rome also threw off its Etruscan-inspired king's cloak and went to work conquering Italy. By the end of the 6th century BC, most of central Italy was under Roman control. But here's the thing about being an ancient Italian. If you're not Roman, life kind of sucked. Just ask the Latins, a confederation of Italian tribes who lived south of Rome. After Tarquinius had fled Rome, he'd gone down to southern Italy and started stirring up the local tribes against Rome. For the next 100 years, the Latins and their allies, like the Etruscans and the Greeks, would fight on and off with the Romans. Eventually, Rome won and brought the Latin League under their control. Then, the Romans set their sights northward towards the wealthy and militaristic Samnites. Rome was surrounded by rivals. The Latin League, Etruscans, and Samnites all vied for control, so the stage was set for some serious butt-whipping. So now, let's go back to the big cheese. We'll start with the map. Okay, here we are in the Peninsula d'Italia. Notice the green area around Rome. That's where Rome controlled at the start of the show. But notice there are other Italians around them. As the show goes on, Rome expands. But remember, they're not the only ones. Okay, let's talk about the big conflict of this episode, the Samnite Wars. I mentioned in the last episode that the Samnites were strong and warlike. In fact, they had 3 big advantages over Rome. 1, they were very experienced in battle. 2, they had the backing of the neighboring Lucanians and Bruti. 3, they had the mountains. Their mountainous homeland made it difficult for any invading army to surprise them. And the Samnites knew every twist and turn of those hills. The Romans would fight 3 wars with the Samnites over the course of the next 100 years. The Samnite, the Second Samnite, and the Third Samnite Wars. The first 2 ended in stalemate, but the Third Samnite War resulted in a major Roman victory. So let me break down one of the greatest battles of the war, the Battle of the Caudine Forks, which humiliated the Romans like nobody's business. Now picture the scene. It's 321 BC. The Roman army is marching through a narrow mountain pass. Suddenly, the ground shakes as thousands of Samnite warriors pour over the hillsides, blocking the pass. Enraged, the Romans abandon their formation and charge headfirst into the enemy, only to be cut down by the Samnite swordsmen. Without their front line, the Romans collapse and are forced to surrender. So that's a tough loss for the Romans. But that won't be the end of it. Let's see what happens next. Back in Rome, the Senate has convened. They need to figure out how to win the war. The consuls, the chief magistrates of Rome, propose changing the way Rome fights. You see, Rome's military was organized into centuries, groups of 80 soldiers each, led by a centurion. Each century was composed of younger men, not quite old enough to be considered part of the class of older men. Because of this, many Roman soldiers did not have much experience in battle and depended heavily on their officers to tell them what to do. The problem was when the Romans lost a battle, often the officers would die along with the rest of the soldiers. This created a situation where sometimes Roman generals had more experience as slaves than their own soldiers. To fix this, the Romans would create the legion, a much more flexible and disciplined fighting force. Here's a 3D breakdown of a Roman legion. Most sources agree that this is the best way to visualize a Roman legion because it takes into account written accounts, archaeology, and other pieces of art. When it comes to recreating Roman formations, I know this may look complicated, but I promise you it isn't. So, the heart of the legion is made up of 10 cohorts, groups of soldiers, numbering 480 men each. These cohorts were further subdivided into 6 maniples, groups of 120 men, led by a centurion. Some sources describe how these maniples were arranged in 3 ranks, but this may just be artistic license. I don't really buy it because if this were true, Roman soldiers would have gotten pretty tired of standing while carrying their shield and their spear. And that's just my opinion. But remember, Rome's military was always evolving. Okay, this is gonna take a minute. Each cohort had 5 maniples of hastati, or young frontline troops, 3 maniples of principes, or middle line troops, and 1 maniple of triarii, heavy infantry, who only saw action when things got hairy. There was also a group of 80 cavalrymen attached to the cohort, along with 2 special units, a group of 40 light troops called velites, and a group of 20 men whose job it was to carry standards and ensigns to remind troops where they needed to be. This type of organization allowed soldiers to adapt to different situations on the battlefield and helped make the Roman army one of the most flexible and powerful fighting forces of the ancient world. Back in Italy, Rome took their new legions into battle and began to gain the upper hand against the Samnites. Rome won the Third Samnite War in 298 BC, and the Samnites were forced to cede lands to Rome, lands which Rome would never give back. Over the next few decades, Rome continued to conquer Italy. By 264 BC, most of Italy was under Roman rule. Now, the thing is, Rome had grown ambitious, and they weren't satisfied with just ruling Italy. The Romans looked across the Mediterranean and set their sights on an empire. But before Rome could dominate Italy, they had to get past one big obstacle: the Carthaginians. Here's a map of the Mediterranean. Remember how, in the last episode, Rome kicked the Etruscan booty northwards? Well, there's this place called Latium, and it's right between Rome and the sea. So Rome wanted it, but so did the Etruscans. They argued over it for a while. But then the Etruscans packed it in and decided to kick back in their cozy corner of northern Italy. The Romans, though, they kept looking towards the sea, watching the big bad Carthaginians sail around in their fancy navy. So Rome decided to build their own navy to challenge Carthage for control of the western Mediterranean. In 264 BC, Rome and Carthage went to war, kicking off the First Punic War. Both sides fought over control of the island of Sicily, but Rome came out on top and expanded their empire beyond Italy. Wait, but how did Rome beat Carthage at sea? Didn't Carthage have the biggest navy in the Mediterranean? And didn't Rome have like one ship, a galley powered by slaves? Well, actually, yes, Carthage did have the bigger navy, but Rome was okay with that, because they had something better, the Corvus. The Corvus was a boarding ramp that connected two ships together, turning a naval battle into a land battle. And guess who was better at land battles, Rome or Carthage? In 241 BC, after 23 long years of bloodshed, the First Punic War ended. Carthage lost Sicily and the western Mediterranean, and Rome now ruled the seas. Now, remember at the beginning when I said that Rome was going to conquer the world? Well, the first step is usually the hardest one. So getting control of Italy and defeating Carthage in the sea was a huge achievement for the Romans. But trust me, this is only the beginning. Next time on the rise and fall of Rome, Rome faces its greatest nightmare, the brilliant general Hannibal Barca. Don't miss it. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, please like and subscribe for more historical tales. Also, check out my series, The Rise and Fall of the Samurai, on another channel. And hey, if you want to help us reach our goal of 100,000 subscribers, you can check out our support page. And until next time, remember Rome wasn't built in a day, but it kinda fell in one. Rome had conquered Italy and mastered the sea. Yet across the Mediterranean, a storm was brewing, led by a man whose name would haunt Rome for generations: Hannibal. In Carthage, a boy stood before an altar and swore an oath: "I will never be a friend to Rome." That boy was Hannibal Barca. His father Hamilcar had fought and lost the First Punic War. Now, Hannibal prepared for revenge, not by sea, but by the most daring land invasion in ancient history. In 218 BCE, Hannibal led an army of 90,000 men and 37 war elephants across Spain, through Gaul, and over the snowbound Alps. Rome thought it was impossible, but against all odds, Hannibal did it. By the time he descended into Italy, he had lost half his army, but shocked the Romans by appearing where no enemy had ever dared. At Trebia, he lured Roman soldiers into freezing rivers. At Lake Trasimene, he set an ambush so perfect, 15,000 Romans died without warning. But nothing compared to Cannae. Outnumbered, Hannibal encircled and destroyed a Roman army of over 80,000 men, the worst defeat in Roman history. Rome had never seen terror like this. But Rome did not collapse. Its people refused to surrender. The Senate declared, "We will never negotiate with Hannibal." A new strategy emerged. Led by Fabius Maximus, Rome stopped fighting and started shadowing Hannibal, avoiding full battles. They called him the Delayer, and though mocked at first, his tactics saved the Republic. Years passed. Hannibal marched, but Rome endured. A young general named Publius Scipio took the fight to Carthage's doorstep. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio faced Hannibal himself and won. The Second Punic War was over. Hannibal was exiled. Carthage humbled. Rome had faced its greatest nightmare and survived. But victory came at a cost, and the Republic had changed forever. Next time on The Rise and Fall of Rome, the Republic expands, the rich grow richer, and a man named Julius Caesar rises in the shadows. Hey there, welcome to the channel. It's me, and today we are counting down our list of the top 10 most evil villains from the world's most beloved stories. Coming in at number 10 is the Joker from DC Comics. No matter how many times he's taken out or put away, the Joker always seems to come back again, causing trouble for Batman and leaving a path of destruction and chaos in his wake. Number 9, Darth Vader, who needs no introduction. The iconic villain from Star Wars is known for his evil deeds across the galaxy. Even though he has a tragic backstory, it doesn't make up for all the damage that he does in the series. Number 8, Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This character is so evil she actually won a Best Actress Oscar for her portrayal. She is a manipulative and sadistic nurse who runs a psychiatric ward and uses her power to control those around her. Coming in at number 7 is Dolokhov from War and Peace. He may be a historical figure, but this Russian military leader was known for his brutal and violent ways. He tortured and murdered those who opposed him, and is considered one of the most evil characters in literature. Coming in at number 6 is Hannibal Lecter from The Silence of the Lambs. Need we say more? This brilliant but sinister psychiatrist and serial killer is one of the most unforgettable villains in cinema history. Coming in at number 5 is Thanos from Marvel Comics. He may seem like a tragic character with noble intentions, but Thanos is a ruthless and powerful villain who destroys entire planets in pursuit of his goals. Coming in at number 4 is Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter. This dark wizard is the most feared villain in the wizarding world and will stop at nothing to achieve immortality. Coming in at number 3 is Hannibal Lecter from The Silence of the Lambs. Need we say more? This brilliant but sinister psychiatrist and serial killer is one of the most unforgettable villains in cinema history. Coming in at number 2 is Sauron from The Lord of the Rings. This dark lord is the ultimate evil in Middle-earth and will stop at nothing to achieve his goal of dominating all of the free peoples. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, we have Cesare Borgia from The Prince of the Renaissance. This infamous Italian noble was known for his ruthless and cunning ways and is considered one of the most evil villains in history. Thanks for watching. Which villain is your favorite? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an upload. See you next time. I've got 3 words for you. Rome, burn. Welcome back to the series. Let's get right into it. Now, if you want more context about what you're seeing here, we'll put a link to our last episode in the description below. In the last episode, we saw Carthage defeated and destroyed, leaving Rome the sole master of the Mediterranean. It seemed like nothing could stop the Roman juggernaut. But the prophecy of the Punics was correct. Rome did indeed become fat and decadent after the war. For over 50 years, peace settled across the Mediterranean. The Roman people prospered, built magnificent villas, and enjoyed luxury like never before. Most of all, they basked in the security and stability of the Republic. This prosperity led to complacency, corruption, inequality, but above all, ambition. Across the city, the contrast was stark. On one side, the great landowners and merchants flaunted their wealth. On the other side, the working poor starved while living hand to mouth. While rich Romans drove around in chariots, the streets were a mire of mud and refuse. You might even see a gladiator or two walking around with his net and trident. You know, Rome's most famous innovation. The middle class shrunk. The infrastructure deteriorated. Violence erupted in the streets. Playa, who were tired of being pushed around, fought back against the patricians. Many nights there were pitched battles in the Forum. Honestly, it was such a mess that Rome didn't even feel like Rome anymore. And in this moment of crisis, a man from an old but struggling patrician family named Gaius Julius Caesar saw an opportunity to seize power. Yes, that guy. But I hear you asking, wasn't Caesar supposed to be the villain? Well, yes, he is, but bear with me because this isn't the Caesar you've probably heard about yet. Our story actually begins in 133 BC, when the Marians and Sullan factions went to war. Sulla, remember him? Yeah, the dude from last episode. Anyway, he made Caesar, who was just a teenager at this point, commander of his forces in southern Italy. But young Caesar refused to follow Sulla's orders to pillage the countryside, and instead abandoned his post and fled to Greece. After Sulla's death, Caesar came back to Rome and started studying rhetoric. He eventually won the hearts and minds of the people and proved himself a talented administrator. He also became a member of the First Triumvirate, an informal alliance of 3 men who controlled Rome, which we'll talk about next. During this time, Caesar spent a lot of energy playing up his public persona. We have statues of him showing his perfect body. It was no accident. Caesar cultivated a reputation of strength and masculinity. He dressed the part too. Think togas and sandals. No, think blonde hair highlights and perfectly manicured facial hair. So when the time was right, he could seize power and take Rome to the next level, because this is where the Caesar you probably know begins. As part of the First Triumvirate, Caesar was granted command in Gaul, today's France. And let me tell you, no one expected him to do much there. They thought it was a boring backwater. But boy, were they wrong. Over the course of 8 years, he conquered all of Gaul. He crushed Celtic resistance, including the fierce warrior Vercingetorix, who surrendered to Caesar after the siege of Alesia. While he respected his enemies, he showed no mercy when it came to crushing resistance. Caesar's wars in Gaul made him extremely wealthy. He extracted massive amounts of gold, silver, and other resources from the region. Caesar's armies looted cities and countryside alike. There was no accounting for the booty. All of it was Caesar's to keep. Caesar's prestige grew along with his wealth. When he returned to Rome in 46 BCE, he was greeted like a god, but not everyone was happy about Caesar's rise. His ally Pompey turned against him. Crassus was dead, and the Senate was suspicious of Caesar's growing power. It seemed that every 2 years, Rome had to go to war, and now they had someone else to blame. So when Caesar was ordered to disband his army, he said screw it and decided to start a civil war. A small force of Caesar's loyalists crossed the Rubicon River into Italy. When he realized what Caesar was doing, Pompey fled to Greece. Soon, almost the entire Roman world was caught up in the violence. So ended the Roman Republic. With Pompey gone, Caesar was the undisputed master of Rome. Now this brings us back to our opening scene. Caesar paraded through the streets of Rome in 45 BCE. It was clear to all that Rome was now a dictatorship. The Republic was gone, The crowds cheered. As Caesar took power, many saw him as Rome's savior. For all the turmoil of the last decades, Caesar promised to bring stability back to Rome. At last, the Republic had a strong leader who could fix everything. He wasted little time in passing reforms, appeasing the playa, giving land to the poor, raising salaries, stabilizing the currency. Within months, he put down revolts in the provinces and reasserted Roman authority. The civil war was over. The die was cast. It was done. But there were still a few problems. 1. Caesar never defeated Pompey's sons, who were still hiding in the east. 2. He never really solved the inequality that plagued Rome. 3. He ignored many of Rome's old traditions. The Senate still existed, but Caesar made it clear that he was more powerful than they were. To the end, senators plotted against Caesar. They couldn't stand that a man of the people was bossing them around. So now we come to the Ides of March, 44 BCE, on the calendar that bears its name. The day began like any other. Caesar walked from his house to the Senate building, stopping to admire a statue of Alexander the Great. On the way, he passed the Theater of Pompey, a monument to his victory over Pompey. As Caesar entered the Senate, he ignored warnings of danger. He consulted the soothsayer who told him, "Beware the Ides of March," but he dismissed it. Why would anything happen to him? He was invincible. Instead, thinking of his upcoming triumph, Caesar made the fatal mistake of ignoring Calpurnia, his wife, who begged him not to go to the Senate that day. She had a premonition that something bad would happen. When he arrived, a group of senators greeted him, including some of his closest friends. It was a trap. The senators fell upon Caesar and stabbed him over and over again. He was killed instantly. It said that he was stabbed 23 times, and among his attackers was the senator, Marcus Junius Brutus, whom Caesar had made a close friend. The conspirators thought they were saving the Republic, but instead they paved the way for the fall of Rome as we know it. In our next episode, Octavian, later known as Augustus, will emerge from the chaos to create the Roman Empire. So don't miss it. See you then. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, show your support. It really helps us grow. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time. Caesar was dead. The Republic hoped it had been saved, but instead, it ignited a firestorm. March 44th, BCE, Rome descended into chaos. Caesar's killers claimed to save the Republic, but the people wanted revenge. Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, rallied the crowds. But another figure quietly emerged, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted heir. Taking advantage of the confusion, Octavius escaped Rome and began to raise armies. A civil war was coming. At first it seemed like the senators had the upper hand, but then something remarkable happened. In the provinces, former Caesar supporters rose up and defeated the senators, killing many along the way. Soon, even Rome itself fell back into Caesar's hands. Brutus and Cassius fled, regrouping in Greece with the help of Cicero, the famous defender of the Republic. This time, though, it was personal for Octavius. He would hunt them down himself. After 2 years of preparation, the stage was set for war. 42 BCE, Octavius, Antony, and Lepidus met secretly in the Italian province of Brundisium and formed an alliance calling themselves the Second Triumvirate. They each controlled different parts of the Roman world. Lepidus took Africa, Antony took the east, and Octavius took the west. And all three agreed that the assassination of Caesar needed to be avenged. Soon, the hunted became the hunters. In 41 BCE, Octavius and Antony pardoned Caesar's killers, seizing power while pretending to restore the Republic. Then they turned on the others, crushing any opposition to the triumvirate. With their enemies defeated, Octavius and Antony divided the spoils. Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, were hunted down and defeated at Philippi in 42 BCE. By 40 BCE, the entire Roman world was under the control of the triumvirs. With revenge complete, only one question remained. Who would rule Rome? The answer came soon enough. First, Lepidus stepped down in 38 BCE, tired of being sidelined. Then Octavian and Antony split up, falling in love with two Egyptian sisters, both named Cleopatra. But they didn't just fall in love. They became rulers of the greatest civilizations in the ancient world. Octavian and Antony ruled the West and East respectively, while Cleopatra held the throne of Egypt. And no one could rival them. Yet their relationship turned sour, possibly because Cleopatra expected them to team up and conquer Rome. Instead, they ruled separately. Antony openly defied Roman customs, making their relationship official and having children with Cleopatra, while Octavian kept his distance, only taking one official wife and behaving like the perfect Roman aristocrat. He was careful to uphold tradition, showing everyone he wasn't like Antony. For the Romans, that was a problem. Foreign-loving monarchs were nothing new, but Cleopatra and Antony broke all the boundaries. They went public with their relationship and even built temples to each other. Worse yet, Cleopatra demanded her own kingdom in Italy, which Antony conceded. That was too much for Octavian. He knew how to play the game and he used it to his advantage. Octavian painted them as traitors, foreign-loving monarchs, threatening Roman liberty. The people listened, and so began the final act of the Roman Republic. The civil war between Octavian and Antony was unlike any before it. For starters, it was fought across the entire Mediterranean. It was also more complicated than any other conflict because there were so many moving parts. Most of all, it was a political war, fought not just with armies and navies, but with propaganda and diplomacy. Each leader tried to convince nearby kingdoms to join their side, while Octavian focused on the seas. His best friend and military commander, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, was a naval genius. They won small battles against Antony and Cleopatra's fleets, but never a major victory, which gave Antony hope. Perhaps the tide was turning. Then came 32 BCE, when Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet met the Roman navy in the Ionian Sea near Actium. It was the largest naval battle in the ancient world. While some Roman ships attacked head-on, others circled around, raining fire arrows onto the enemy. Smoke filled the air and flames spread quickly, setting ship ablaze. This continued until nightfall, leaving hundreds of ships sunk or destroyed. But neither side had achieved victory. However, during the chaos, Octavian spotted Cleopatra's ship and knew this was his chance. As she sailed away from the battle, he sent a few ships after her, forcing her to flee to Egypt. Next morning, Antony realized what had happened. Though technically a draw, the battle was a disaster for his reputation. As the news of his flight reached Rome, Octavian seized control and claimed victory. Soon, the entire Mediterranean was his. He chased down Antony and Cleopatra, giving them one last chance to surrender, but they chose to fight rather than submit. And as the siege dragged on, Cleopatra grew weaker. She knew that if Rome captured her, she would either be killed or forced to marry Octavian. Neither option appealed to her, especially since she was pregnant with Antony's child. So she killed herself by allowing an asp to bite her. Antony found out and killed himself shortly afterwards. The civil wars were finally over. After conquering Egypt, Octavian returned to Rome in triumph. No one was left who could rival his power. And so the Senate celebrated. They granted him new titles, Augustus, meaning revered, and titles for his descendants, establishing a dynasty that would rule for centuries. In fact, they granted him so many titles and honors, he became known by his full name, Octavian Augustus. Augustus, meaning revered. As the first emperor of Rome, Augustus ushered in a new era of peace and prosperity, known as the Pax Romana, meaning Roman peace, that lasted for 200 years. Everyone hoped the Republic would return, but really, Augustus held absolute power, and so the Republic died on his watch. But even Augustus understood the need for appearances. Even though he was emperor, he insisted on being called princeps, which meant first citizen. Augustus claimed to be the first citizen of Rome, cleverly ignoring the irony that he was more like king than president. Either way, the Senate loved it. They celebrated his return to Republican ideals, hailing him as the restorer of Rome. And the celebration was not without merit. Augustus brought peace to the chaotic Roman world, rebuilt Rome after years of civil wars, reformed the tax system, standardized weights and measures, and reorganized the entire government. All the while, he waged wars and expanded the empire, including the annexation of Egypt. Augustus created a professional standing army to defend Rome's borders. Previously, Rome had relied on volunteer militias. This army, however, was deployed throughout the empire to protect its far-flung borders and keep the peace within. The result was a more orderly and stable empire. But Augustus's legacy was never fully about politics. More than anything else, Augustus wanted to be remembered as the patron of Rome. His monuments, great and small, were visible everywhere. Statues of Augustus stood in every city, sometimes copied from the same mold. He rebuilt Rome's infrastructure, including aqueducts, roads, and public buildings. Some say even the Colossus of Rhodes was funded by Augustus. Augustus was famous for these projects. One historian described it perfectly. Augustus thought it necessary that everything which made for the beauty of Rome should be supplied at his expense. However, Augustus's desire to be remembered blinded him to reality. In art and on coins, he was always young and handsome, and many statues of him were copies of the same mold. In fact, no Roman emperor ever looked like Augustus did in his youth, not even Augustus himself. He commissioned a cult to deify him and his ancestors, and anyone who opposed him was labeled an enemy of the state. Most of all, Augustus worked tirelessly to promote his family's interests, ensuring his dynasty would rule Rome for generations. At the end of his life, he appointed his stepson, Tiberius, as his heir. But that wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was the beginning of the next chapter in Roman history, one full of great emperors and mad tyrants. It was a long way from the fields of Actium to Rome. Rome now ruled from Britain to Egypt. Roads, laws, and legions tied the empire together. Augustus ruled wisely, but made one thing clear. The Republic was dead. Rome belonged to the emperors now. We've reached the end of our series. Can you believe it? Rome went from a small village to ruling the entire Mediterranean. But that doesn't mean we have to say goodbye. There are plenty of stories left to tell about Rome. Maybe you want to hear about gladiators or the Colosseum. Or perhaps you want to know about the Emperor Caligula. known for his wild parties and excesses. Well, we've got you covered. Just hit the subscribe button and stay tuned. We'll see you next time. Augustus built an empire out of ashes. But what would those who followed him do with his legacy? Gods, tyrants, legends, all were drawn to Rome's throne, but few walked away unscathed. From the heights of glory to the depths of despair, join us as we uncover the greatest stories of the Caesars. With Augustus, the age of emperors began. They were gods to some, tyrants to others. Some led with vision, others with madness. Rome would never be the same. He began as a beloved heir, but soon Caligula descended into madness. He hosted feasts inviting 8 men of only one type, bald, short, or fat. According to Suetonius, he chained chariots to chariots like horses and raced them through the streets. When a gladiator refused to fight, Caligula unleashed poisonous snakes into the audience and watched with amusement as the crowds panicked and fell victim to poisonous bites. And when he wasn't organizing races or releasing deadly snakes into the audiences of the Colosseum, he chained women to chariots like horses and whipped them as they pulled him around. The spoiled prince also appointed his horse, Incitatus, to the Senate and had coins minted in his honor. Caligula's excesses outraged the Roman people and the Senate. His spending left Rome on the brink of bankruptcy. And in 41 CE, when the spoiled prince was returning from a debauchery-filled tour of Greece, Caligula met his end. The spoiled prince was shot to death by his own guards, Cassius Caria, a bald man who was denied access to Caligula's infamous party. For bald, short, or fat men, then came Nero, artist, tyrant, arsonist. Born into privilege, Nero was the perfect child. Adopted by the Emperor Claudius, he grew up with every opportunity imaginable. He received the best education money could buy. He was tutored by the famous philosopher Seneca, and he had the most powerful position in the empire at his fingertips. On June 64th, a fire broke out in the city. It raged for 6 days, consuming nearly 10% of Rome, destroying approximately 500,000 homes, and displacing an estimated 100,000 people. Many blamed the emperor's wife, Poppaea Sabina, who had been seen playing with a torch. Or maybe it was Nero. Historians have long debated whether Nero actually played a role in starting the blaze. Tacitus thought he did. So did Cassius Dio, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, and even the 1st century historian Juvenal. However, accounts from the time were often exaggerated or unreliable, and other historians have argued that there is no evidence that Nero had anything to do with the fire. Was he really that cruel? Was he really that irresponsible? Most likely. Did he start the fire? We can't say for sure. But what we do know is that Nero seized on the disaster to accomplish his goals. In the aftermath of the fire, Nero accused the Christians of arson and initiated one of the first and largest persecutions of the followers of Christ. By the end of the century, Christianity had spread throughout the empire, in part because of the example set by Christians who refused to deny their faith under torture. And yet, for all his alleged cruelty, Nero also won favor with some of his subjects through acts of generosity and public works. In the aftermath of the fire, he spent vast amounts of money on public works projects, including housing, hospitals, and schools. He was an accomplished musician and frequently delighted his subjects by performing in taverns and brothels. But beneath this veneer of popularity, all was not well. Secret hatred burned in the hearts of many Romans, including members of the imperial family. In 68 CE, Nero's own grandmother, Agrippina the Younger, had him killed. But not all were monsters. Between the madness came the 5 good emperors. After Nero's suicide, chaos gripped the empire. For the next 9 years, 4 emperors would hold the throne, none of them lasting longer than 2 years. But in 96 CCE, a retired general named Nerva stepped onto the scene. He ruled wisely and justly, establishing a precedent of restraint and dignity. He ushered in an era of stability and prosperity. When Nerva died after a reign of almost 3 years, he passed the torch to Trajan, one of Rome's greatest emperors. Under Trajan, Rome reached its greatest territorial extent. The Dacian king Decebalus was finally defeated. The Parthians were driven back across the Tigris River. In the east, the Roman army penetrated deep into Mesopotamia. In the west, Trajan campaigned against the Germanic tribes along the Rhine. Although his campaigns were costly in terms of lives, they were extremely popular among the Roman populace. But Trajan was more than a great warrior. He was a great administrator too. He built roads, aqueducts, public buildings, and public baths across the empire. He reformed the Roman legal system and promoted the arts and literature. When Trajan died in 117, the responsibility fell on Hadrian. His rule marked the end of the Pax Romana, but it also saw the completion of many of Trajan's building projects. Hadrian was particularly interested in strengthening the defenses of the empire. He traveled extensively, visiting every province, and undertook major building projects, such as Hadrian's Wall in Britain, the Villa and Mausoleum of Hadrian near Tivoli, and the temple complex at Baalbek in Syria. He was a patron of the arts and literature, and his reign saw the flowering of Roman culture. Hadrian was succeeded by Antoninus Pius, who was followed by Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors. Unlike his predecessors, Marcus Aurelius inherited the purple at an advanced age. He was a philosopher by calling and wrote extensively on Stoicism. He believed that happiness and tranquility of mind came from accepting whatever fate brings. He was the right man for a very bad time. A plague, perhaps the deadliest in history, was sweeping across the empire, killing millions. Wars with the Germanic tribes and the Marcomanni flared up and spread to the Balkans. Rome's finances were in sharp decline. The empire was in sharp decline. Yet Marcus Aurelius persevered. He worked tirelessly to improve the lives of his subjects and restore order to the empire. Unfortunately, Marcus Aurelius' son, Commodus, saw himself as the embodiment of the ancient hero, Hercules. While still a teenager, he entered the lists of the Roman arena and slew a lion. He performed these feats annually, adding to his popularity with the Roman people. He demanded to be called not just Caesar, but Hercules. He exhibited a disturbing fascination with the violence. He personally murdered those condemned to death, sometimes with his own hands. Once he surprised a young woman whom he had sentenced to death and cut off her head while she was bathing. Once he unleashed poisonous snakes into the audience at the Gladiator Games and watched with amusement as the crowds fell prey to poisonous snake bites. To finance his wars and pleasures, Commodus devalued the currency, causing hyperinflation and widespread economic hardship. In 180, he neglected his duties, leaving the defense of the empire to his advisors. In the midst of the chaos, Marcus Aurelius died, thinking he had passed the purple to the capable hands of his son. Instead, he had handed Rome over to a monster. Soon after he became sole emperor, Commodus took the title Lucius Aelius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, forever linking himself to the divine founder of the dynasty. He then emptied the treasury, ruined the economy, and alienated the Senate. Finally, his own sister, Faustina the Younger, had him strangled in his bathtub. Crisis gripped the empire. Power struggles, civil wars, and corruption overshadowed Rome. And so began the crisis of the 3rd century. During the following 3 centuries, the empire was plagued by incessant warfare, inflation, plagues, usurpers, and barbarian invasions. The 3rd century was the worst period in the history of the empire, which was now being held together by sheer force of will and the threat of military intervention. People were taxed heavily. Food shortages and high prices caused unrest. Usurpers seized provincial armies and marched on Rome. Armies mutinied. Commagene governors rebelled. Barbarian tribes pushed through the Danube and the Rhine, pillaging and burning. In 260, 17,000 Roman soldiers perished in the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Soldiers deserted the army, preferring starvation and exposure to death in battle. But even amidst the turmoil, the 3rd century was a time of cultural richness. Roman literature flourished with authors like the poet Statius and the historian Herodian. Roman art matured, moving from the classical style of the first 2 centuries towards a more realistic depiction of human emotions and experiences. And the Roman law continued to develop. The Emperor Aurelian attempted to restore order by reforming the administration, coining a new currency, and re-establishing military discipline, though his reforms were successful in stabilizing the empire. He died in 275 without naming an heir, plunging Rome once again into a succession crisis. With each passing decade, the empire was unraveling faster than ever. In less than 2 centuries, it would cease to exist. Next time, Rome is tested like never before. Plague, invasion, crisis, the beginning of the end. Thanks for watching. Rome stood as a titan, but even titans bleed. In the 3rd century, the unthinkable happened. The empire began to tear itself apart. Between 235 and 284 CE, Rome faced its greatest internal crisis. Dozens of emperors rose and fell, often murdered by their own soldiers. Civil wars ravaged the empire. Provinces broke away. And meanwhile, enemies attacked from all sides. The Goths, the Persians, even plague itself. In this episode, we'll explore what went wrong, how Rome almost fell, and how it began again. Welcome back to the channel. We continue our series where we look at how the western half of the once great Roman Empire collapsed and fell into a seemingly endless dark age. To understand why the Western Empire fell, we need to look at how it nearly fell in the 3rd century. For this is the tale of how Rome overcame its greatest ever crisis and lived to fight another day. Let's jump right in. The first piece of the puzzle is an economic collapse. Rome's treasury was running out of cash. Now, that's not to say they were flat broke. They still had plenty of gold and silver in reserve. But maintaining the empire required a lot of money. So the government issued more and more coins to meet their expenses. Problem was, they didn't have enough precious metals to make all these new coins. So they started clipping and shaving off pieces of the coins, lowering their value. Meanwhile, they kept printing more and more of them. Soon, people lost faith in the currency. Traders demanded to be paid in gold and silver. Inflation soared. Bartering returned. People used livestock and sacks of grain instead of money. Towns shrank as people left for the countryside. Country folk moved to cities. It was a mess. Even roads fell into disrepair as no one had money to fix them. Rome was bleeding and its lifeblood was draining away. To understand what happens next, we we need to take a closer look at this map. This is the year 260 AD. You can see the main Roman Empire here, but notice these two breakaway states. Over in Gaul, the western provinces had declared independence from Rome and set up their own empire. And over in the east, this region known as Palmyra broke away too. Rome lost 1/3 of its territory. They were now fighting two separate wars to take back control. Rome had fallen apart. In the west, the Gallic Empire survived only a decade, falling in 274 CE. But in the east, the story was different. Here, a woman named Julius Caesar took control. She manipulated the aging Emperor Elagabalus into naming her son, the young and ambitious Julius Caesar, co-emperor. Then she let him do all the work, while she took all the credit. After Elagabalus died, Zenobia declared herself empress, starting her own dynasty. Her empire spanned from Mesopotamia to Egypt and into North Africa. She recruited experienced generals and bureaucrats and reorganized her army. Her domain was stable and prosperous, far better than war-torn Rome. But Zenobia's rule spelled trouble for the rest of the empire. The central government couldn't protect its people anymore. Local officials were left to fend for themselves against Zenobia's armies. The entire eastern half of the empire was at risk. All hope seemed lost. Rome was a shadow of its former self. So, who was in charge? Well, there was no clear successor to the throne. Senators and generals argued and fought over who should be emperor. Many were killed. The empire was thrown into chaos. This period has been dubbed the crisis of the 3rd century. What happens next is known as the soldier emperors. Throughout Rome's history, military commanders had always held significant power. It was no surprise when one emerged as the most powerful man in Rome. Marcus Aurelius's grandson, a man named Septimius Severus, seized power in 193 CE after defeating his rivals in civil war. By the time he died, though, his health was compromised, and he had alienated many key advisors and allies. So when he passed the imperial title to his two sons, Geta and Caracalla, the results were disastrous. Caracalla murdered his brother Geta and proceeded to execute anyone who opposed him. He was unpopular and impulsive and reckless. When Caracalla died in 217, the army wanted change. They chose a soldier named Macrinus to be emperor. He was the first non-royalty to hold the title in 20 years. Unfortunately, he proved to be a weak leader. He hesitated to put down rebellions, and the army grew resentful. When a strong general named Ignatius Septimius came along, the troops quickly switched sides. Septimius was soon proclaimed emperor. His reign was short but decisive. He suppressed rebellions, restored order, and marched his legions across the Danube. After Septimius died, though, the cycle repeated itself. Civil war erupted again. Provincial governors and ambitious generals scrambled to seize the throne. But amid the chaos, one man stood out. His name was Gordian, an ordinary soldier. One day, he found a wounded eagle, the symbol of Rome. He nursed it back to health. Then when his fellow soldiers revolted and claimed the imperial throne for themselves, he helped them win the war. Soldiers loved him because he gave them back their symbol of Rome. Next, a usurper named Pupienus took the throne. He tried to slow down the rate of coinage debasement. Then he was killed. Next came Balbinus. He appointed a committee to address the economic crisis. He too was killed. Then came the usurper Decius. He attempted tax reform. Then he was killed. Then came Trebonianus Gallus. He fixed the coinage, but then he was killed. In just 6 years, 9 emperors met their demise. The imperial office was becoming a death trap. Amidst all this turmoil, Rome lost control of its borders. Germanic tribes known as Goths burst through the Danube and swept across the Balkans. Rome needed a hero, and it found one in Aurelian. He was born Gaius Aurelius Verus in 214 and joined the army at 17. By the age of 30, he had fought in 3 continents. History remembers him as a tough, battle-hardened warrior. But he wasn't just a brawler. Aurelius was also a brilliant strategist and tactician. In 253, he seized control of Rome and set about fixing the empire. First, he went to war. He campaigned in Pannonia and defeated the Goths. He launched campaigns against Zenobia in the east. He recaptured Roman territory and built massive defensive walls around Rome itself, strengthening its defenses. He rebuilt and resettled cities, battled outbreaks of disease, and stamped out revolts. He also redefined the role of emperor and gave himself the title Restitutor Orbis, which means restorer of the world. Sadly, this hero of Rome did not live happily ever after. As with so many other rulers of Rome, his own men stabbed him in the back. By the year 284, Rome had endured a century of chaos. The steady march of progress that had defined Rome for centuries had become a frantic struggle just to survive. Through it all, one man emerged, Diocletian. Born Gaius Aurelius Diocletianus in 244, he had a humble start in life. He worked as a secretary, then became a senator, and eventually served as a military officer. By 284, he was in his mid-40s and ready for more. When the aging Emperor Carus died suddenly, Diocletian seized the opportunity. He led his troops to victory against rebel armies, earning him the loyalty of the troops. The Senate hailed him as the new Augustus. Notice though, I said Caesar, not Augustus. Senate knew that things needed to change in Rome, and they were eager to help Diocletian reshape the empire. What does this mean? Let's take another look at the map. Here's the empire divided. Diocletian appointed 2 Caesars, Maximian in the west and Galerius in the east, while he ruled the western half, and his close friend, Massianus, ruled the east. Each Caesar had full power to rule their half of the empire as they saw fit. They were equal partners in a new system known as the Tetrarchy, meaning rule of 4. This new system solved the problem of incompetent or tyrannical emperors. If one went rogue, the others could rein them in. And if an emperor got too old to rule, they could pass the job on to their chosen heir. In fact, that's exactly what happened. In 305 BCE, Diocletian abdicated the throne in favor of his designated successor, but he kept the title of Augustus. Meanwhile, his partner Massianus retired too. Power officially remained in the hands of the Caesars. Now there were a few problems with this arrangement. For one thing, it required a huge amount of organization and cooperation between the rulers. But more importantly, the center of power had been moved away from Rome. Most of the action was happening in the east. This transition would ultimately lead to Rome losing its dominance and influence in the world. But that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out episode 7, The Fall of the Western Empire. And don't forget to subscribe for future episodes. Thank you. From the ashes of the burning empire, 2 halves rose again. There was Rome in the west and Rome in the east. Yet as both empires struggled for survival, another power stirred, born not in palaces or battlefields, but in catacombs and groves. It spread through whispers and sermons, the message of one crucified Savior. By the end of the 3rd century, Christianity had gone from a Jewish sect to an established religion. By the start of the 4th century, it would become the state religion. This is how Constantine became the first Christian emperor. Rome was changed, split in two, reforged by force. But soon, a new force would rise, not by sword, but by faith. When Diocletian stepped down in 305, he left behind a wounded empire. Civil war erupted. Rival generals seized territories and claimed the purple. Among them was a man whose name would echo through history. Born in 272, Gaius was raised with little privilege. His father was a low-ranking soldier. His mother was a tavern keeper. Yet fortune smiled on him. As a young man, he entered the imperial court as a chariot driver. Soon enough, his skills earned him notice and advancement. And when civil wars broke out across the empire, he found himself a general. He scored victories in revolt after revolt, gaining land and soldiers until in 306, while stationed in Britain, his troops proclaimed him emperor. The empire was still divided. Rivals contested every corner. Constantine would have to fight for it all, yet the gods seemed to favor him. On his path to Rome, he met none resistance. Cities fell before him. Fields were filled with the spoils. All seemed set for Constantine. But across the Tiber, another emperor held Rome. Licinius had unified the East. Then came the moment of truth, the clash of armies at the Milvian Bridge. There they stood, two emperors facing off, each claiming legitimacy, each determined to rule. But that night, something remarkable happened. Legend tells of Constantine walking alone along the banks of the Tiber, praying for guidance. As dawn approached, he looked up and saw a brilliant light in the sky. Emerging from it was a cross bearing the words, "In this sign, conquer." And just like that, a vision transformed a battle. When Constantine awoke, he ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol on their shields. He gave the order in Greek, and the scene was later written down by one of his soldiers, Lactantius. Thus, we know what happened next, how Maxentius attacked, and how Constantine's men repelled the charge. According to legend, when Maxentius saw the crosses, his troops faltered. They lost all courage and fled. That day, October 28th, 312, Constantine won a decisive victory. Rome was open to him. Maxentius was dead. Constantine had conquered, and it seemed by divine providence, over the next 3 years, he campaigned north and south, wresting lands from rebels and establishing peace. In 313, he met with Licinius, who had taken much of the east. Together they issued the Edict of Milan, ending Diocletian's persecution of Christians and granting everyone freedom of worship. For the first time, Christians were not hunted, they were protected. But Constantine didn't just tolerate Christianity, he favored it. Churches that once huddled in shadows now stood proud. Bishops traveled freely. Persecution turned to protection, fear to favor, and no one embodied this change more than Constantine. According to legend, when he entered Rome, he wanted to see the great sights. So he visited the Pantheon, the Colosseum, the Forum, but then he asked to be shown the place where St. Peter had been crucified. He walked over the ruins of the Circus of Gaius and Nero, climbed the Vatican Hill, and envisioned a church rising there. He funded its construction, and with it, the age of Christian Rome began. Yet, Constantine wasn't done. If Rome was the center of the Western Empire, then Jerusalem should be the center of Christendom. So in 326, he embarked on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. He cleansed the Temple Mount, built churches over Jesus' birthplace and tomb, and hosted the first great council of Christianity. Scholars would gather there for centuries to come. Still, as impressive as these accomplishments were, a greater one awaited. As Constantine toured the eastern provinces, he realized the capital was in the wrong place. If Rome was the center of the old empire, then here in the east, a new center was needed. It had to be near the heart of trade, safe from barbarian raids and close to the lands Constantine planned to conquer. After searching the coast, he chose a peninsula jutting into the Bosporus, the narrow strait connecting the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It was a vital trading hub, guarded by natural barriers and right between Europe and Asia. On this piece of land, Constantine would found a new Rome. The work took 8 years, but the results were glorious. Golden domes pierced the sky. Marble pillars lined the streets. Palaces replaced barracks. Hagia Sophia, the most spectacular church in the world, was constructed from the spoils of war. By 330, when Constantine dedicated the city, it was magnificent. The name he chose echoed its glory. Constantinople was a Christian city, a second Rome, and it would outlive the Western Empire by 1,000 years. There was only one thing left to do: unite Christianity under one faith. Scholars were debating over scriptures, squabbling over the divinity of Christ, and Constantine grew impatient. To fix this, he summoned all the bishops to a council in Nicaea. Over 300 men arrived ready to argue, but Constantine silenced them. He laid out his vision of a united church, then unleashed his secret weapon, his sister, who had converted to Christianity and now played the role of a saintly intercessor. Thus, for 315 days, the bishops argued, debated, and compromised, until finally emerging with a concise list of beliefs. This became the Nicene Creed, which remains part of Christian worship today. With this foundation in place, Constantine continued to shape the church. He ordained priests, consecrated churches, and even sculpted the very coinage with Christian symbols. From the emperor who once painted crosses on shields, Constantine became the champion of Christianity. Now, some may call him a shrewd politician, using religion to solidify power. Some a devout believer spreading the word of God. Some a ruthless conqueror, taking advantage of a fragmented faith. Others, a lonely man in search of salvation. All these images are true, but to truly understand Constantine, we must look at the end. According to legend, as he lay on his deathbed, he sent for a bishop and confessed his sins. Then he requested baptism. The ceremony started. Water was blessed. But the moment arrived when the dying emperor had to immerse himself. Too weak to move, he waited for someone to come forward. No one did. And so, according to historian Eusebius, Helena, his mother, entered the room and baptized him. Constantine the Great was now a servant of Christ. So was this the divine providence Christians believed? Was this a God-ordained path to salvation? Some will say yes, some will say no. Yet in the end, one thing is clear. As Constantine ushered Christianity into prominence, he reshaped an empire. He turned Rome from a pagan state of swords and conquest to a Christian state of souls. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe and join us next time for the continuing adventures in ancient history. Rome had transformed, Christianized, divided, and scarred by centuries of chaos. Now the Western Empire stood on the edge of a blade. Hey there, welcome to this house. Today we are exploring the final days of the Western Empire in Episode 10, The Fall of the Western Empire. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And let's get into it. In 395 CE, the empire was permanently split, east and west. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, grew stronger, but the West was weak, underfunded, undermanned, and under siege. Rome itself had become a ghost of its former glory. Now from the north came wave after wave of pressure. Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, and Huns. Some sought refuge, others came as conquerors. In 410 CE, Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome. It was the first time in 800 years that the Eternal City fell to an enemy. With their siege engines, they smashed open the gates, sending the population fleeing into the countryside, looting and pillaging everywhere they went. They burned palaces and public buildings. They destroyed pagan temples and Christian basilicas. They carted off treasure and slaves. They committed atrocities that left a scar on the very soul of Rome. After 4 days of total havoc, the Visigoths withdrew, leaving behind a traumatized city and an empire in tatters. And so Rome had tasted defeat, but now it would know terror. For across the Danube River, a new force was gathering. They were led by a man called Attila, the Scourge of God. He built an empire that stretched from Germany to the Black Sea. It was a realm of horsemen who lived by the sword. Attila threatened both east and west, and so an uneasy alliance was formed. Both Romans paid tribute. Then suddenly, without warning, he marched on Rome. The Goths fled. The defenders panicked. Nothing stood against the fury of the Huns. Yet somehow the city survived. Legend has it that Attila was stopped by the most unlikely of heroes, Pope Leo I. As he entered the city, he fell gravely ill and soon died. Perhaps it was divine retribution. Perhaps it was coincidence. All we know is that the scourge never made it back home. Meanwhile, while enemies gathered outside, Rome rotted from within. Emperors were puppets placed on thrones by generals or barbarian kings. Taxes soared, armies deserted, provinces were lost. By the middle of the century, Italy looked like this, a patchwork quilt of Roman and barbarian territory. But still, Rome endured. And then in 455 CE, Genseric and the Vandals reached Rome by sea. This time, the sack lasted 2 full weeks. The Eternal City was looted, temples were desecrated, nobles taken hostage. Even the tomb of St. Peter was forced open, though legend says it was protected by an angel. Again, Rome limped away, bleeding treasure, dignity, and pride. So the imperial court decided that to survive, they must move to Africa. In fact, let's zoom out a bit. Across the Mediterranean, the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire was doing quite well. In fact, it would last another 1,000 years. Now you can watch our series on the Byzantine Empire here. But for now, let's head back to Italy and see how things ended for Rome. By the late 400s, the empire was hanging on by a thread. Most everyone wanted to be their own boss. So what happened next? Well, it wasn't exactly a glorious end. In fact, it was rather embarrassing. In 476 CE, a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor of the West, a boy named Romulus Augustulus. There was no fanfare, no last stand. No one really noticed at first. Then finally, a letter was sent to the Eastern Emperor saying, there is no need for 2 emperors anymore. So, that's it. That's how Rome fell, right? Well, kind of. Let's go back to that letter. When the courier arrived in Constantinople with the news, he expected congratulations. Instead, he got an audience with the emperor. He received gold coins for his trouble and was told to have a nice day. You see, to the east, Rome falling didn't really change anything. Oh, they They acknowledged the deposition technically, but life went on as normal. To the west, however, all was changed. Forever. That is, until 1453. Watch our series on the Byzantine Empire to find out how. It's easy to look back and pinpoint the fall of Rome as a single moment, a precise date when everything changed. But history isn't that neat. The reality is that Rome fell many times over a span of centuries. Still, if we must choose a moment, then let it be this. In 476 AD, a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor of the West, a boy named Romulus Augustulus. Now some would say that Rome actually fell in 395 when the empire was split in two. Others would argue that it was 410 when the Visigoths sacked the city, or 455 when the Vandals took their turn. Each of those moments certainly dealt death blows to the West, but ultimately it was a slow hemorrhage that played out over several generations, and in the end, it was the usual suspects: corrupt officials, child emperors, endless civil war, and creeping barbarians. That was the undoing of Rome. Looking back, we can see that it was inevitable, but at the time, hope flickered on. The end for centuries. The dream of Renaissance was still alive. And although they would eventually come to dominate the West, the Germanic tribes had yet to take Rome. To be clear, there are many ways to define the fall of Rome. Historians disagree on where to start and stop counting. What we chose to focus on was the Western Empire, specifically the Roman Senate. When it lost effective control over Rome and Italy, Rome had been sacked twice in the previous half-century, and it was clear that the old Roman way of life was gone forever. And yet, this wasn't the end. Not really. Ideas don't die. They evolve and adapt. Ancient Rome gave birth to concepts that shaped Western civilization. Its art, its architecture, its literature, its poetry, its ideals of citizenship, its system of law, even its language, Latin, echo down through the ages. From Rome came roads that connected distant lands. From Rome came a republic and then an empire. From Rome came the foundations of medieval Europe. In a very real sense, the story of Rome is our story. We are the heirs of the Romans. Their achievements were ours. Their mistakes, our lesson. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check out the rest of the series. And thank you for watching.